Cluster feeding. What is it? There will be many times during your breastfeeding journey your baby will cluster feed. It happens within the first 24 to 48 hours after birth. We talked earlier about supply and demand, the ins and outs of how women's body make breast milk. When your baby is cluster feeding, it's the way your baby talks to your body and tells your body she needs more milk. It's feedings close together. So what does this look like in real life? It can look exhausting. Your baby may breastfeed for what seems like a full feeding, fall asleep for 10 minutes, and wake back up acting hangry. Then she might breastfeed for 5 minutes, stop feeding, be fussy, and act uncomfortable as if she isn't getting anything at the breast, have hiccups, feed again, fall asleep during the feeding, and then wake up ready to feed again. Cluster feeding happens more during the first 6 weeks, but it can happen around developmental leaps and growth spurts as well, and it happens in the evening sometimes. Evening cluster feeding can help your baby start extending nighttime sleep by allowing her to get more calories during the day. On my schedules I share in my babies course, you'll notice that evening feeds are clustered together. These feedings are key to extending nighttime sleep. If you try to hold your baby off from feeding during the early evening hours, it can work against your desire to extend nighttime sleep. Since we're talking about cluster feeding, I want to share with you some real-life examples of how this works. If your baby hasn't had a poopy diaper in a few days, you might notice him being less interested in breastfeeding. Maybe his feeds are shorter in duration, or maybe he's dropped a feed or two for a few days. Your body will start to adjust to his new feeding pattern if he feeds this way for 2 or 3 days in a row. Then he'll blow it out, his belly will feel better, and he'll be ready to eat again. But it'll take a few days for him to get your supply back in tune with what he needs. So he'll do some cluster feeding to help send the message to your body that he's ready for more milk. Another example, when breastfeeding babies are sick, and especially when you're sick, they may have a feeding pattern similar to the one I just talked about. Your illness and their irregular and less vigorous feedings can affect your supply in the same way, and your baby will probably cluster feed during or after the illness. What about cluster feeding and nighttime sleep? This information is really important. This piece of the puzzle gets lost a lot with mothers that are breastfeeding. And a lot of the sleep difficulties experienced during infancy can be traced back to this missing piece of the puzzle. For breastfeeding babies, the amount your baby takes in at each feeding session is going to be different each time. Your baby isn't going to eat the same number of ounces at each feeding. Just like you or I are hungrier or less hungry at different times throughout the day, your baby is too. When you're breastfeeding your baby, he'll stop feeding when he's full. Here's something else you might not have thought about. Your available breast milk is going to change throughout the day. For example, you're going to have more available at the morning feeds than you do at 5 p.m. It's just the way our bodies work. It doesn't mean you have a supply issue. Think about how you feel at the end of the day. I know I feel tired and stretched. At the end of the day, your afternoon and evening feedings, your baby will be getting less ounces per feed than he does in the morning. That's one of the main reasons breastfeeding babies cluster feed in the evening. So let him cluster feed. It'll help with extending nighttime sleep. Of course, there are some other factors involved here like overstimulation and babies being overtired that can also affect nighttime sleep. And I talk about that more in my babies course. But you can't ignore the feeding part of the equation when you're looking at nighttime sleep issues.